August 21st, 1327. In the chilling confines of Berkeley Castle, a king once revered, then reviled, now merely a prisoner, felt the cold breath of the Severn wind seep through the ancient stones, a harbinger of the ultimate chill. Edward of Caernarfon, King of England, a man whose life had never truly been his own, stood on the precipice of an oblivion crafted not by divine decree, but by human cruelty and relentless ambition. His last days were meticulously planned, each moment stripped of dignity, each breath a testament to a power he had squandered and then tragically lost, ending with a grim, counterintuitive ceremony of death that defied the very essence of regality. This was not merely the end of a monarch. It was the brutal, calculated immolation of a man, engineered to ensure no trace of his existence remained, to challenge those who had usurped his throne. His demise, cloaked in official obfuscation and whispered horrors, stands as a testament to the devastating fragility of even the most absolute power. But to grasp the weight of this moment, to truly understand the depths of the torment inflicted, we must first trace the winding, ill-fated path that led a son of kings to such a desolate, witnessless end. To understand why a crowned head would meet such an ignominious fate, one must look beyond the immediate treachery and delve into the very fabric of Edward's upbringing and the expectations thrust upon him from his earliest breath. Born in the shadow of Caernarfon Castle, presented to the Welsh as their new prince, Edward II was heir to a legacy of formidable, unyielding kingship embodied by his father, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. Yet the younger Edward possessed a temperament ill-suited to the martial rigors and ruthless pragmatism demanded of a medieval monarch. His interests gravitated towards the arts, towards companionship, towards a life of pleasure, rather than the relentless pursuit of conquest and administrative detail that consumed his father. This inherent divergence from the expected royal prototype sowed seeds of discontent long before he ever wore the crown. From childhood, he displayed an alarming propensity for surrounding himself with favorites, men who, whether through genuine affection or strategic manipulation, gained an undue influence over him, often alienating the very nobility whose support was crucial for stable governance. This recurring pattern, a profound misjudgment of character and political necessity, would become the persistent, gnawing wound in his reign, a wound that would ultimately fester into a devastating, fatal infection. The throne, an artifact of immense power and brutal expectation, seemed to fit him as uncomfortably as a crown of thorns, always pressing, always drawing blood. His ascension to the throne in 1307 merely amplified these foundational flaws, transforming personal inclinations into national crises. Edward II's reign was characterized by a profound and persistent conflict with his barons, ignited and reignited by his unwavering devotion to Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose charm and wit were matched only by his arrogance and capacity to antagonize the English magnates. Gaveston, showered with titles and wealth, became a lightning rod for baronial discontent, perceived as an undue influence on the king and a drain on the royal treasury. This deeply personal attachment, seen by the nobility as an affront to their dignity and a subversion of traditional governance, escalated into open rebellion, forcing Edward to banish and recall Gaveston multiple times, each return further eroding the king's authority. The Articles of the Ordinances, imposed by the barons in 1311, were a direct attempt to curb royal power and restrict the king's freedom to appoint his own councillors, a humiliation that underscored Edward's political weakness and his inability to command the respect of his most powerful subjects. This was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of a systemic failure of leadership, where personal loyalty trumped political acumen, and the pursuit of individual companionship overshadowed the needs of the kingdom, leading inevitably to a pervasive, corrosive instability. The cycle of conflict, banishment, and return culminated in the brutal capture and summary execution of Gaveston in 1312, a stark warning delivered by the barons to their king, a sacrifice of blood intended to demonstrate their resolve. Yet Edward, reeling from the loss, proved himself incapable of learning the fundamental lessons of power and compromise. Instead of mending fences and consolidating authority, he merely replaced one controversial favorite with another, transferring his affections and the vast power of royal patronage to Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father. The Despensers, ruthless and avaricious, proved far more dangerous than Gaveston, systematically alienating a broader swathe of the nobility and even the Queen, Isabella, herself a powerful figure in her own right, daughter of the King of France. Isabella, initially a loyal if frustrated wife, found herself increasingly marginalized, her lands stripped, her children's inheritance threatened by the rapacious Despensers. This systematic dismantling of her power and dignity, coupled with Edward's coldness and the Despensers' relentless cruelty, pushed a queen to the brink, transforming her resentment into a searing hatred, culminating in a devastating, unimaginable betrayal. Her journey from wife to avenger would set in motion the final, irreversible descent of her husband. The chasm between Edward and Isabella widened irrevocably, exacerbated by the Despensers' relentless machinations and Edward's own stubborn refusal to recognize the gravity of his political isolation. Isabella, finding her pleas for justice and restitution ignored, was sent to France in 1325, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. This mission, however, became the fertile ground for a far more audacious plot. In Paris, Isabella, the she-wolf of France, as history would later brand her, forged a formidable alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord and a bitter enemy of the Despensers. Their liaison, both political and personal, became the engine of Edward's downfall. With French backing and the support of disgruntled English exiles, Isabella and Mortimer launched an invasion of England in September 1326. The swiftness and overwhelming success of their campaign underscored the king's utter lack of support. His former allies abandoned him. His power had evaporated, and the system meant to protect him had become merely a hollow shell. This invasion marked the definitive end of Edward's kingship, a brutal public stripping away of every vestige of his authority, leaving him vulnerable and alone, a hunted man facing the inevitable consequences of his catastrophic misjudgments. The hunt was swift, brutal, and relentless. Edward, abandoned by virtually everyone, fled westward, his once grand retinue reduced to a handful of loyalists and the despised Despensers. His capture near Neath Abbey in Glamorgan in November 1326 marked the true moment of his public, symbolic death. The ensuing events were meticulously orchestrated to humiliate and dehumanize the king, stripping him of his regality piece by piece. Hugh Despenser the Younger, the architect of much of Edward's misfortune, suffered a grotesque and protracted execution in Hereford, a spectacle of public vengeance designed to satisfy the bloodlust of the rebellious barons and underscore the brutal shift in power. But Edward's fate was to be more drawn out, more psychologically devastating. Brought before a specially convened parliament at Kenilworth Castle in January 1327, he was presented with an impossible choice: either voluntarily abdicate or be deposed by force. Faced with the stark reality of his utter powerlessness, his voice broken by despair, Edward agreed. A king forced to surrender his crown, his dignity, and ultimately his life, not on a battlefield, but in a solemn public act of coerced capitulation. This moment of deposition, witnessed by a stunned assembly, was not justice. It was a warning, etched in the very soul of England, a chilling testament to the fragility of inherited power. Following his forced abdication, Edward's imprisonment became a macabre journey through the various strongholds of his enemies. He was moved from Kenilworth to Bristol, then to Corfe, and finally to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, each transfer designed to keep his location secret, to isolate him from any potential loyalist plots, and to break his spirit. The conditions of his confinement were progressively harsh, his jailers seemingly intent on hastening his demise through deprivation and psychological torment. Stories, likely exaggerated but rooted in a grim truth, circulated of his hair being roughly cut off with cold water from a ditch, of his being forced to wear a crown of hay, of his being denied the basic comforts and dignities afforded even to common criminals. These indignities were not arbitrary acts of cruelty. They were deliberate attempts to utterly dehumanize the former king, to erode his identity, and to erase any lingering aura of his royal personhood. The purpose was clear: to prevent any rally around his name, to ensure that his death, when it came, would be seen not as regicide, but as the unremarkable expiration of a broken man, a figure so diminished that his very existence posed no threat. He was a king made prisoner, then merely a man, then something less than human. By the time Edward reached Berkeley Castle in early 1327, the stage was set for his final act, orchestrated by the implacable Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella. The choice of Berkeley was no accident. Its isolation and the loyalty of its keepers made it an ideal location for the grim work ahead. The immediate purpose of his transfer was sinisterly clear: to ensure his death before any attempts could be made to rescue him, before the whispers of a surviving king could ignite new rebellions. Under the charge of Thomas de Gournay and William Ockley, men known for their ruthless efficiency, Edward's final days were a period of escalating despair and physical decline. Though the exact details remain shrouded in deliberate ambiguity, accounts from the time and later chronicles suggest a relentless campaign of physical and psychological abuse, designed to hasten his end without overt violence. His diet was poor, his environment cold and damp, his spirit systematically crushed. The objective was clear: to induce a natural death if possible, but to ensure that his voice, his very presence, was extinguished before it could ever threaten the new regime. The king, stripped of his crown, his freedom, and his very name, now faced a fate far more terrible than public execution. September 21st, 1327. The grim narrative of Edward II's final hours is chillingly sparse, yet hauntingly vivid in its implications, deliberately obscured by those who orchestrated it, but clear enough in its brutal outcome. On this night, within the cold, unyielding stones of Berkeley Castle, the silence of the remote fortress was pierced by a king's last agonizing scream, a sound described by chroniclers as so terrible it echoed through the castle walls, reaching the ears of terrified villagers nearby. The method of his demise was designed to leave no outward marks, to be presented as a natural death, yet the horrific nature of his end was immediately suspected. Tradition, reinforced by later accounts, speaks of a red-hot iron inserted into his bowels through a horn, a barbaric act that ensured internal hemorrhage and death without external blemish, a brutal parody of a king's last rites. This was not justice. It was an act of extreme, calculated brutality, a definitive severance of all royal claims, meant to be without witness, yet the very violence of the act ensured its dark immortality in the collective memory. The man who had been king had become a silent, suffering sacrifice on the altar of political expediency, a testament to the devastating lengths to which power would go to secure its hold. The immediate aftermath of Edward II's death was characterized by a concerted effort to control the narrative, a chilling testament to the culpability of those in power. A public announcement declared that the former king had died of natural causes, a convenient fiction that few truly believed. His body was embalmed, publicly displayed at Gloucester Cathedral for a time, then interred in a magnificent tomb, a striking contrast to the clandestine brutality of his end. This elaborate funeral, a solemn, almost performative ceremony, was a cynical attempt to erase the memory of his torment and to legitimize the new regime under young Edward III. Yet the whispers persisted, the stories of his agonizing last moments, the chilling silence from Berkeley Castle, all contributing to a growing unease and suspicion among the populace. The legacy of Edward II's death is not merely the end of a king, but a profound and haunting reflection on the nature of power, betrayal, and the brutal measures taken to secure a throne. His story, stained with injustice and shrouded in deliberate ambiguity, serves as a mournful insight into the dark underbelly of medieval politics, a period where human vulnerability clashed violently with unchecked ambition, leaving an indelible mark on the annals of history. We must remember his suffering, not just as a historical footnote, but as a perpetual warning against the abuses of power and the tragic consequences of a system that fails to protect its most vulnerable, even a king.